If you are the citizen of a society that keeps failing to do right by you, when is the correct time for rebellion? What are you owed? The American Revolution was not the first time that such things were asked, but no one had really considered before that the purpose of a nation was its duty to create conditions for success for people. In the world that had existed up to this point, the main purpose of the governing structure was just to provide protection against some invasive force. It was only beginning to occur to people that a government could be something more. I'm Anne Grace Evans, and this is a practical guide to American history. In the second half of the 18th century, Britannia, without doubt, ruled the waves, and all her subjects were flushed with pride. But soon, some came to suspect that they weren't viewed the same as proper Englishmen. Nor did they have the same view of the conflict they had just fought. Britain was, frankly, broke. In Parliament, Prime Minister Lord Grenville asserted that this kingdom has the supreme legislative power over America. It cannot be denied. And taxation is a part of that sovereign power. Protection and obedience are reciprocal. Great Britain protects America. America is bound to yield obedience. When they want the protection of this kingdom, they are always very ready to ask it. That protection has always been afforded them in the most full and ample manner. The nation has run itself into an immense debt to give them this protection, and now they are called upon to contribute a small share towards the public expense. Colonists felt this was insulting. It completely diminished their role as British citizens. But Parliament was determined to press ahead with its plan to tax the colonies, and in 1764 they imposed a duty on sugar and molasses. It was actually a reduction of the overall tax on molasses, but no one had really been paying that. Now the government was cracking down on smuggling so that everyone would have to pay it. Basically, the British government would end up taking a cut of a trade that they really had no concern in. Why should a transaction between supplier, merchant, and customer involve Parliament? Citizens of Boston, organized by one Sam Adams, held a town meeting to draft a letter to their representatives in the Massachusetts legislature. The Massachusetts House of Representatives, in turn, sent a petition to the House of Commons in London with the complaint that a tax on sugar was too heavy a burden for the average citizen to pay. On top of this, there was also the Stamp Act of 1765. Today, no parcel can be sent without a stamp. That's a tax, and we accept it because we know that that money is doing something useful. It's paying for the operation of the Postal Service. The Stamp Act required everyone to pay a similar duty by buying stamps. And that would be fine. Taxes are necessary for things that would improve the security and prosperity of the people paying them. But Parliament had explicitly stated that these were to pay the war debt. Britain's war for the Ohio country. That place where Americans were no longer even allowed to go. What's more, this stamp wasn't just for mail. It had to be put on everything. Legal documents, employment contracts, newspapers, even playing cards. Economists' estimate of the average household income at the time was about £14. That meant that, with the stamp tax added, the cost of a newspaper would feel like the equivalent of $25 to us. A marriage certificate, because yes, marriages were also subject to this tax, was roughly 2% of the average person's annual income. Sugar you could boycott, potentially try to live without. The Sugar Act had been more like a tariff. This was a direct tax. A member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, explained what was really at the core of Americans' anger. By two royal charters granted by King James I, the colonists are declared entitled to all privileges, liberties, and immunities of natural-born subjects. The taxation of the people by themselves or by persons chosen by themselves to represent them, who can only know what taxes the people are able to bear. and are equally affected by such taxes themselves, is the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, and without which the ancient constitution cannot subsist. Therefore, the General Assembly of this colony have the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes upon the inhabitants of this colony. Here I have to make a slight historical digression. In 1215, the barons of England rebelled and forced King John, the bad guy from the Robin Hood stories, to make a decision. He could either be deposed, or he could agree to their demands. Long story short, John was a pretty terrible king. Under his predecessors, the Kingdom of England had controlled a good chunk of modern-day France as well. Then John had gone and lost almost all of it. So to fund his attempts to get his old lands back, he levied a bunch of taxes, just willy-nilly whenever he felt like it. No rhyme or reason, no receipts to prove that it was money well spent, which, judging by his continued failures in France, it was not. So having had enough of being bled for money and having nothing to show for it, the barons forced him to put his name to a legally binding document that would rein in his ability to take a cut of his subjects' money without warning. It was called the Magna Carta. This was that ancient constitution that Patrick Henry was talking about. Magna Carta states that no king can levy a tax without the agreement of the taxpayers. A special body, Parliament, was created to officially consult on and give their approval of any new tax. But it wasn't simply that they would give their consent to a new tax. No, each parliament would demand something in return. If the king wanted revenue from them, he would have to issue a reaffirmation of their rights, as well as address new concerns they might have. Basically, Magna Carta established the concept of government being transactional. People aren't going to give their loyalty to an authority without receiving some benefit in return. It also introduced the idea of due process. No monarch could act however they wanted, whenever they wanted, because it was the right of an English citizen to know what to expect from their government. There's another thing I should mention. Up to this point in American history, official British policy towards the colonies was one of salutary neglect. In essence, previous British governments had operated with the understanding that it was much more beneficial for all parties involved if they just let the Americans do whatever it was the Americans did. So the Declaratory Act was a complete reversal of policy, that the Americans actually shouldn't be allowed to manage their own affairs, when up to this point, that's what they'd successfully been doing. This causes a dangerous thought to start to take hold. One that Parliament was coming to recognize far too late. If we've been doing fine on our own, then why exactly do we need you? What exactly have you done for us, other than tax us for a war we never asked for or benefited from? If the king's justice is arbitrary, then there's no way for the average person to successfully navigate the world they live in. To make sure that John and his successors adhered to the document, the enforcement mechanism for Magna Carta was that the people could rise against the king if the terms were violated. Just something to keep in mind. More clandestinely, the likes of Sam Adams, Paul Revere, and John Hancock got together to see what measures could be taken outside of the official but limited legal ones. The Sons of Liberty were born out of a desire to push back against the Sugar and Stamp Acts in a more, shall we say, direct way. Members of these semi-secret societies throughout the colonies sought to harass and impede the work of customs officials and tax collectors through acts of vandalism and occasionally violence. The practice of tarring and feathering, literally pouring tar and feathers over someone, wouldn't necessarily kill you, but it would cause severe burns, and attempts to remove the tar and feathers from your skin would often cause all the skin to peel away. This was the punishment for someone who was really only trying to do their job. In one action in Brunswicktown, North Carolina, colonists virtually placed the governor under house arrest to prevent him from allowing a ship with the hated official stamps to dock. But as these associations of angry citizens continued to grow, Their efforts turned from petty acts of violence to organized political action like committees of correspondence. These were semi-official bodies that took the pulse of places throughout the colonies and shared it with their liaisons in the British Parliament. And it worked. In 1766, Parliament repealed the Sugar and Stamp Acts. It was a victory for collective organizing and upholding the rights of Englishmen. Sort of. Because Parliament turned right around and issued the Declaratory Act, which made it as clear could be that no, the actual adults didn't recognize the colonists' protest efforts as anything more than a tantrum. Of course, one member of Parliament stated, "No person consents to be taxed." After all, who actually wants to pay taxes? But seeing as they are what fund the government, all citizens, even Americans, are duty-bound to pay them. There's another thing I should mention. Up to this point in American history, official British policy towards the colonies was one of salutary neglect. In essence, previous British governments had operated with the understanding that it was much more beneficial for all parties involved if they just let the Americans do whatever it was the Americans did. So the Declaratory Act was a complete reversal of policy, that the Americans actually shouldn't be allowed to manage their own affairs, when up to this point, that's what they'd successfully been doing. This causes a dangerous thought to start to take hold, one that Parliament was coming to recognize far too late. If we've been doing fine on our own, then why exactly do we need you? What exactly have you done for us, other than tax us for a war we never asked for or benefited from? Parliament, fearing they were losing in the court of public opinion, decided that they needed to fight the tax and duty battle in a different court altogether, namely the Court of the Royal Navy. As part of the new Townshend Acts, colonists indicted for smuggling lost the right to a judgment by a jury of their peers, which they had always enjoyed. Now the Royal Navy, essentially a court-martial, would determine their guilt or innocence. And these courts were not incentivized to lean towards innocence. Here's the thing about the loss of due process. It isn't really something that's flexible. You can't just relax or invalidate certain judicial guarantees, such as a jury of one's peers, on a temporary or emergency basis, and expect that things will simply return to normal without a hitch. A system that exists as understood and agreed to by both parties, again, like a trial by jury, works because people trust it. They know what to expect, and that they'll get a fair shake. Take it away without their consent, and you erode that trust. If there is no trust between government and governed, then there can be no peaceful maintenance of order. And once the peace is breached, the likelihood is high that distrust will only further spiral out of control. So the fact that the Townshend Acts had already stripped the New York legislature of its ability to make laws was definitely not helping to keep the population under control. The reason for this was because New York had refused to comply with an earlier law, the Quartering Act of 1765. Remember when, after the war, the British had decided that it would be best to leave some troops behind, just to ensure the peace. Well, what that actually looked like was posting troops in American cities, living in American barracks, eating their food, and keeping tabs on them. It didn't matter that this was a great expense to the local population. It was non-negotiable. The Sons of Liberty, if the British government had indicated that they had nothing more to say to the colonists on the subject, that was fine. They wouldn't use words to communicate their frustrations either then. They shifted their focus from rioting and acts of vandalism of British imports to harassing lobsterbacks, so-called because of the red coats that British soldiers wore. Things continued uncomfortably like this until the tension between local population and occupying force reached its perhaps inevitable conclusion. On March 5th, 1770, a single sentry was on duty outside the Customs House in Boston when he started getting hassled by an angry crowd gathered around him. When he called on the rest of his regiment for backup, things became confused, and the soldiers ended up firing into the crowd. 5 people were killed. Even though through the representation of a young Boston lawyer named John Adams, the soldiers were acquitted, a Rubicon had been crossed with the Boston Massacre. The trust of the people once lost is difficult to earn back again. An ugly truth had been revealed. On that night, in that square, those soldiers didn't see the colonists as citizens whose rights they were there to protect. They saw them as the enemy. After the massacre, the need for open lines of communication that committees of correspondence provided was greater than ever. Except now, instead of focusing their communication efforts on persuading any parliamentary liaisons, these committees turned their efforts to communicating amongst themselves, organizing mass action across the colonies. As Benjamin Franklin had predicted, if the colonies had any hope at all of providing a strong argument to the king and to Parliament, then they would need to do so together. There were some in Parliament who actually agreed that maybe the colonists did have a point. Perhaps some of the measures that the government had been implementing had been too harsh. Maybe if at this point Parliament had completely capitulated, the colonists might have cooled down, and history may have turned out differently. But that's not what they did. Parliament would repeal almost all of the Townshend Acts, except for one, the tax on tea. So as far as the British were concerned, that should have put an end to it. So the tea is a bit more expensive. Everyone would get over it eventually. Of course, it didn't work out like that. This duty gave the British East India Company a monopoly on the sale of tea in all of Britain's colonies. This wasn't just a tax or an annoying presence on the street. This was wholly invasive. The government was dictating what ships could import tea and what shops could sell it, directly interfering in the business affairs of the merchant class living in port cities. Then as now, British citizens, which the American colonists at least nominally still were, loved their tea. This was something that was unavoidable in a person's day-to-day life. Not only did the British East India Company have colonists over a barrel on how much they would have to pay for this household staple, but also merchants like John Hancock. And it wasn't just the wealthy merchant class of places like Boston that would suffer by being cut out of the tea trade. The whole ecosystem of a port city was interconnected, so if those merchants were struggling, so would those who were employed to oversee their shipping, and the tailors and silversmiths and other artisans who received their patronage. What would have to be especially infuriating is that the British government was instituting this policy because the British East India Company was broke, and the British Crown was highly invested in its success. So Parliament did care about changing its policy to alleviate suffering, only of its companies, not its American subjects. Naturally, the Sons of Liberty, a name ironically coined by one of those sympathetic members of Parliament, were just as ready as they had ever been to cause problems for the British. On the night of December 16th, the Sons of Liberty organized a group of angry colonists they hoped would send a particularly strong message to the British. Dressed as Mohawk Indians, they boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 300 chests of tea overboard. This really sent the British over the edge. Here they had tried to be nice. All they had asked for in return was that the Americans buy the tea they told them to. Well, if they couldn't behave like grown-ups, then there was clearly no reason to treat them like grown-ups. Perhaps this newest round of legislation, the Coercive Acts, would help them see sense. Here, the Quartering Act made a reappearance, except this time, Parliament expected people to quarter soldiers directly in their homes. This massive invasion of privacy was no doubt intended to catch people out before they had the chance to dissent any further. The Coercive Acts were especially directed at Massachusetts, where the British government closed the port of Boston, shuttered the legislature, and gave royal officials a free pass by saying they could only be tried back in Great Britain. For all these reasons, the Coercive Acts came to be known as the Intolerable Acts. It was clear that something had to be done. Different committees of correspondence arranged for representatives of each colony to meet face-to-face. The First Continental Congress met on September 5th, 1774, at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. Maybe, with this first-of-its-kind conference, together, they could make Parliament listen to something? They couldn't seem to come to agreement on how seriously they viewed Britain's actions, or exactly what they wanted the future of America to look like. All they did agree on was, since they hadn't agreed on anything, they would all reconvene in May, and then they would have their solution. Maybe. Though this first Congress had come to nothing, a similar convention in Massachusetts, meeting strictly in secret due to the restrictions of the Coercive Acts, had arrived at a more decisive, if not downright provocative, resolution. It started out meekly enough, with a recognition of the authority of the king, but then it went on to declare that the people of Massachusetts should just ignore the law and start making military preparations, just in case. Parliament viewed these actions as incendiary, as indeed they were probably intended to be. In April 1775, word arrived from England that Parliament had declared the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, and that troop ships would not be far behind. As the news spread, a general resolve developed among the people. One Massachusetts legislator wrote his wife, "The people are ready and determined to defend this country inch by inch." On April 18th, the order was given to the British regulars that a quantity of ammunition and small arms have been collected at Concord. Seize and destroy all military stores. Troop movements in Boston indicated to the population that something must be up. The time had finally come, and someone needed to warn the Massachusetts Assembly ASAP. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Actually, 3 people made the ride, which makes sense. It's a pretty important mission to just send one person. But otherwise, the story's pretty much the way you've heard it. 2 lamps in the church, riders make a desperate dash through the night, British regulars on their heels, warning every household they pass to be up and be ready. Trouble was coming. All able-bodied men would have been part of their local militia. So the man or men of the house, on receiving the signal, would grab musket and spare ammunition and mount their horses in the direction of Concord. Not only was the Massachusetts arsenal in Concord, the provincial congress had decided to hole up there as well. All militia members gathered at Buckman Tavern in Lexington, a town 6 miles from Concord, to make a game plan. First and foremost, they needed to hold off the British regular troops while the arsenal and the legislature were evacuated from Concord. They had all drilled together for such an event as this, but at the end of the day, these people were a motley collection of about 80 farmers with firearms and some basic training. Only one man, the captain, John Parker, had actual military experience, against an advancing army of professionally trained soldiers. At daybreak, the British troops finally arrived in Lexington and were met by Captain Parker's militia. At first, nothing happened, since both sides had been given orders not to fire the first shot. So it's unclear who actually fired the shot heard round the world, since both sides would go on to declare that it was the other in their official depositions. As the British continued on to Concord, the Concord militia prepared to do battle. But as there were only 250 of them, and an estimated 700 approaching British troops, a head-on confrontation would probably not be the wisest course of action. Fortunately, the British weren't there looking for a fight. They had come for the arsenal. While they were distracted with their searching in the town, Concord's militia observed them from the vantage point of a hill a mile north. There, they saw their best chance to engage at Concord's Old North Bridge, causing the British troops to retreat back into Concord, and from there back to Boston. But along the road back, militiamen from all over the area had mustered. The Massachusetts men knew the country and the terrain far better than the British, and they were able to use it to deadly effect. The British returned to Boston without having discovered the majority of Concord's arsenal, and with heavy casualties, while militias from throughout Massachusetts successfully laid siege to their position. At last, the tension that had been building for years erupted into open hostilities, and the colonists had prevailed. They knew the landscape. They had shown their ability to hold fast and improvise under pressure. Perhaps it wasn't just the wishful thinking of disgruntled colonists. Perhaps they could really exist completely independently from Great Britain after all. Of course, something this momentous, an actual military skirmish, would have to be discussed at the upcoming Second Continental Congress. Where was there to go from here, if not open rebellion and war? The delegates had varying degrees of hope that the situation could be remedied. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, not the same guy who founded Princeton, favored reconciliation, thinking that seeking independence was too rash. They had made their point at Lexington and Concord, and perhaps that would be sufficient. Were they really going to go to war, sticking their necks out on account of Massachusetts, where they'd always been a bit loopy? John Adams, a Massachusetts man, felt it was abundantly clear that after Lexington and Concord, there was no going back. The British were no longer in a negotiating mood, if indeed they ever had been, and the only options going forward were complete capitulation or a clean break. And it wasn't just Boston's problem. A threat to one was a threat to all. Join or die. But they recognized whatever they did decide, it would have to be unanimous. At the very least, they needed an immediate solution to the military problem. America didn't have an army, just a collection of local militias, and that wouldn't be sufficient for the scale of the conflict the British were about to bring down on them. John Adams, eager as he was to move the Congress towards independence, proposed the creation of a Continental Army, and he had the man in mind to lead it. War veteran George Washington. If you had to sum up George Washington in one word, it might be discipline. The Hamilton song, "History Has Its Eyes on You," is an appropriate anthem for him, as he always acted with great care to how he and his actions on behalf of America would be perceived by future generations. He was a stoic 6'2" tall, unusual for the day, and certainly cut an impressive figure, especially since he arrived at the Second Continental Congress in a military uniform of his own design, to show that he was ready to take up arms against the British. John Adams knew that everyone would agree that George Washington was the appropriate person to lead the Continental Army, and George Washington was only too willing to accept. So now that we have a commander, we have to actually form an army. The first American troops were made up of companies of riflemen from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, and of course the militias already engaged in New England. This force was entirely voluntary. The weapons they had were ones they brought from home. Perhaps a fraction had ever seen combat before. These men were agreeing to enlist for 1 year with the understanding that they would be paid on a monthly basis and that the Congress would provide uniforms as well as room and board. The Continental Congress, which had only met for the first time less than a year earlier, now they were on the hook for rations and supplies and ammunition, which left them with two major problems. Where were they going to get all this vital war material for an estimated 27,000 recruits? And how were they going to afford it? As Congress started printing paper currency to be able to pay anyone and everyone who could sew uniforms or provide foodstuffs for the army, John Dickinson was allowed to make one final attempt before things descended into all-out war. In this petition, he writes, "Your Majesty's ministers, persevering in their measures, and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defense, and have engaged us in a controversy so peculiarly abhorrent to the affections of your still faithful colonists." It wasn't like Dickinson was doing this out of any great love for the mother country. He was just trying to be practical. What they were talking about was insane. Look at them, printing their own monopoly money and desperately making appeals to housewives and farmers to donate their labor and produce to the cause. Someone needed to stop this thing before they all got in well and truly over their heads. In the end, it hardly mattered. The king wouldn't even receive the petition. Instead, he issued his own proclamation for suppressing rebellion, in which he declared that everyone engaging in any activity related to the Continental Congress was guilty of treason. Here's the interesting thing. King George III was actually a pretty liberal-minded guy. As Prince of Wales, his worldview had been shaped by an education of history that held William III to be the ideal monarch because he saved the nation from the iron rod of arbitrary power. He also said freedom of speech is not only the natural privilege of liberty, but also its support and preservation. Every man, therefore, is allowed to declare his sentiments openly. That's a direct contradiction to his later proclamation, where he states that just the act of sedition, agreeing with or carrying materials sympathetic to the rebels, was considered treason. The fact that he wouldn't even receive Congress's petition, wouldn't even consider the fact that their grievances had to do with how they felt their rights weren't being duly respected, is out of character with his hatred of arbitrary power. So why would he respond this way? That's always the question when someone we admire, or know to be a loving and kind person usually, does something out of character. It's an important one to answer because it seems to come up a lot in American history. Why would people who've supposedly committed themselves to these high-minded ideals then behave so differently? I think there are a lot of reasons, and we'll get to them in the decades and centuries to come. But in this instance, the simplest explanation is that people, when faced with a situation that they weren't expecting, are more likely to fall back on ingrained behaviors. Take George, someone who, as an eager student, wanted to study to become a just king, and probably believed that he would be one when his time came. But none of us really know how we are going to react when we encounter new situations. And someone who has been pampered from birth to believe that his wish is everyone else's command probably wouldn't easily tolerate being disobeyed. There's a real audacity in asking someone to behave as a respectful citizen of a country where they don't enjoy the benefits of that citizenship. If the king's aim was to cow the Congress into submission, his decree had the opposite effect. It had now gone beyond the idea that the king had violated his duties to his people, as stated in Magna Carta. It was that he, and the parliament that was set up to represent the people against the king, had turned around and told the colonists, none of that due process stuff actually applies to you. You don't count. The thing is, with any transactional agreement, if one party sees themselves as exempt from their part of the bargain, why should the other party still feel beholden to it? Plus, now they really didn't have any choice. They had already been labeled traitors. What would committing more treason hurt? But first, the delegates would need approval from their colony's legislative body, and not all of them were necessarily on the same page. Obviously, Massachusetts was done. But there were some colonies, like John Dickinson's Pennsylvania and South Carolina, that needed a little more hand-holding. In the end, all colonies voted for independence except New York, which abstained. Unable to break through a militia-surrounded Boston, the British now had New York City in their sights. Now it came time to draft a formal declaration to the king. Virginia delegate Thomas Jefferson was chosen for this purpose, as he was generally considered to be the best writer. He was a very intellectually curious, if not downright eccentric, polymath, inventing many strange devices and even designing his own house. With the assistance of Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, he framed the document first as a proclamation of what rights all men were entitled to, a statement which would come to be much remarked upon and criticized for its many obvious ironies. The rights which he enumerated were the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was an almost word-for-word copy of the philosophy of Enlightenment thinker John Locke, except for the last part. John Locke states that the rights every man is born with are life, liberty, and property. Perhaps Thomas Jefferson changed Locke's original because he didn't want to be accused of plagiarism. That very well could be the reason. But alternatively, maybe you can read something more into his edit. On the one hand, by not suggesting that all men are guaranteed the right to property, what was Thomas Jefferson trying to say about the type of country they were trying to build? If, in the government they were hoping to create, all these rights of man were at least nominally guaranteed, would would the government actually have owed its citizens property in the Locke version? Was Thomas Jefferson trying to suggest that the government didn't make any material guarantees to its people? Another interpretation of the change is that it put a further emphasis on freedom. Freedom to do and dream and be. Freedom to pursue the things that made a person happy, no matter what anyone else might have to say about it. The government might not guarantee that it would give you material compensation to follow your path in life, but it wouldn't stop you from choosing whatever path you wanted. In England, a country of strict hereditary structures, a person's life was probably pretty much predetermined. In America, it wouldn't have to be that way, because the people would shape the way that society would be. A person could get ahead, become whatever they wanted to be, because they understood where they stood in the framework of America and the steps needed to move forward. Privilege provided by birth or favoritism from royal patronage would no longer present unfair advantages because justice would no longer operate by the whim of a king. That was in fact the whole point of English justice since Magna Carta, since the Mayflower blew off course and the people aboard had to establish some basis for authority. A sovereign can only hold their God-given authority over people if the people feel the benefits of their rule. Otherwise, they're just another random, unspecial person. And, like the barons in 1215, it is within the rights of the people to overthrow them. If you've seen Hamilton, then you're probably familiar with the rap battle Farmer Refuted. A young Alexander Hamilton writes a rebuttal to a loyalist farmer about why independence is not only the right choice for Americans, but will ultimately lead to far greater prosperity. Parliament would oppress and grind the Americans as much as possible. Jealousy would concur with selfishness. If America should be permitted to rise to too great a height of splendor and opulence. Essentially, he's saying that the core argument for America is its industry. That the reason that we should be suspicious of the mother country is that our industrial strength will come to eclipse it, and in response, Parliament would try to stymie American progress and ingenuity. Not only would America survive without Great Britain, it would thrive. For everyone who took a similar view, the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, was a joyous cause for celebration. John Adams wrote to his wife, "It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations, from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward, forevermore." Of course, it also meant war. Warfare in the 18th century was odd, for lack of a better word. When opposing armies would meet on the field of battle, they would form neat lines across from one another. The first line would then fire a musket volley at the other, and if they happened to not be killed by the opposing side's volley or cannon fire, they would then kneel down and allow the next line to fire their volley. While this seems a curious thing to do, the reason for it is that muskets take forever to reload. So as not to be picked off while you were reloading, the line behind you would give you covering fire. After several rounds of volley fire, a commander might order a bayonet charge. A bayonet is a long knife that attaches to the end of a musket, but it will make your shot go wonky. So you can't have it on your musket while firing your volleys. You have to take time out during the battle to fix your bayonet. It's not terribly efficient, but this is the way that gentlemen did war, complete with drummer boy and fife player, which might have made more sense in an earlier time where they wouldn't have been hit by a stray bullet. The problem with doing battle like gentlemen is that whoever had the numbers was more likely to emerge victorious. It wasn't like the Continental Army had no advantages. They were fighting on their home turf, and it is a lot easier to defend territory than it is to go on the offensive. They also were more familiar with the terrain and the climate, and they were by far the more motivated force. This was their home and their lives, giving them far more skin in the game. But fighting a war on Britain's terms meant that they wouldn't be able to leverage what advantage they had, their ability to improvise, like they had at Lexington and Concord. Another issue the new country faced was lack of confidence in its government. Not only was the Continental Congress a brand new governing body, but one of a country in wartime. Up to that point, the United States were all a patchwork of communities who may have considered themselves citizens of their home state, but wouldn't have considered themselves loyal or connected or interested in the fate of the larger landmass as a whole. To fund the Army and Navy, Congress printed a little over $200 million in paper money. The problem is that they lacked the authority to tell the new states how exactly to value these dollars. This led to massive inflation, and for the continental dollar to be essentially worthless. Unlike the pound sterling or Spanish dollar, there was no reserve of gold or silver that guaranteed the value of the dollar notes, just the Continental Congress's guarantee that they were worth something. And at this point, who really believed that this body could guarantee the value of anything? They were attempting to do something so totally unprecedented that there really was no successful example for them to look to. There had been republics and revolts before in history, but never in the history of the modern world had people stood up and declared that each and every one of them, with some major exceptions granted, was worthy of demanding equal treatment. Their government owed them the freedom of opportunity to prosper and excel, and they could do this based on their talents, not their backgrounds. John Adams was a yeoman farmer who practiced law. Alexander Hamilton was a penniless, illegitimate orphan from a small Caribbean island. Up to that point, people like that more often than not went overlooked in the annals of history. These people weren't lords, had no training in how to do this. Not that there would have been any training that could teach them how to build a government from scratch. They needed a formal document that laid out exactly what power Congress did and did not have. They didn't want to be guilty of the very thing that they were fighting to escape, governing arbitrarily. They assigned a committee of 13 to draft the blueprint for the government of the United States of America, the Articles of Confederation, largely written by our old friend John Dickinson. Congress would exist, but there would be no national executive or judiciary. Congress would consist of the same number of representatives from each state and deal with only the major issues, such as the conduct of the war and foreign relations. George Washington surveyed the landscape and decided on the best course of action: strategic retreat. The first blow was expected to fall in New York, which is why they had abstained in the vote for independence, and it did. General Howe, with Hessian mercenaries from what is now Germany, entered New York Harbor with the aim of gaining a foothold there. The theory was that New York, as wealthy and dependent on trade as it was, could be broken off from the rest of America and brought back into the British fold. In late August, British troops landed in Brooklyn. What followed was a rude awakening for the Continental Army. The Battle of Long Island was a series of defeats for George Washington, who was only just able to evacuate his troops to Manhattan. British landed at Kips Bay, chasing the Americans from there to Harlem, and consolidating British control of all of New York City in the process. The loss of the city was a major blow, but George Washington knew that the Continental Army wasn't able to stand and fight the British regulars and Hessian mercenaries, not in their current state at least. The hope was that they would be able to strike quickly and fade away, bloodying the noses of the British while egging them into pursuit. Privately, he wrote to his nephew, "Few people know the predicament we are in. But if he could spread the British thin enough and tax their supply lines, maybe the Continental Army could stay alive long enough to secure the aid of a foreign ally." For this reason, Congress sent an urgent delegation to the sworn enemy of the British, France. In October, Benjamin Franklin sailed to Paris to try to gain an audience with the French royal court. The reception he received was cool. The French were unsure about backing this revolutionary venture. Sure, it would be great to watch their arch-nemesis lose all of its colonies, but could the Americans really pull it off? Or would funding this insurgents be throwing good money after bad? Franklin was a born diplomat, already a celebrity because of his experiments with electricity. He was able to schmooze his way into the right circles with money. Now the Americans needed to convince the French that they were capable of actually winning. Their first opportunity arrived in Trenton, New Jersey. A word about espionage. Until quite recently in history, The act of spying in warfare was considered almost unsportsmanlike. So the fact that Washington had a spy stationed in Trenton, where Britain's Hessian mercenaries were encamped, was slightly underhand for a society that believed that armies should line up across from each other so they could kill one another like gentlemen. The fact that Washington had another man in the same house as the Hessian commander, playing the perfect host, giving him a false sense of security, could be seen as just bad form. But the Americans were desperate. After the loss of New York, enlisted men in the Continental Army were deserting, believing it was hopeless. Even George Washington wrote to his cousin, "I think the game is pretty near up." So they really needed a win, no matter how they got it. There is a famous painting you've no doubt seen, called Washington Crossing the Delaware. In it, Washington stands on the prow of a rowboat as no doubt freezing cold American soldiers row through an icy Delaware River. It was the night of Christmas 1776, and for this reason, General Washington had been reliably informed that the unsuspecting Hessians were in no state to put up much of a fight, and indeed the unprepared and hungover Hessians surrendered pretty quickly. The Americans quickly followed up this victory with one at Princeton, which, while not being hugely consequential in the grand scheme of things, was a huge morale boost for the troops. If nothing else, they showed themselves that they were still in the fight and were even capable of winning, even if the means they used might be frowned on by others. After the war, one British officer commented, "Washington did not really outfight the British. He simply outspied us. But 2 victories does not a war win." And Washington's ragtag army still had a long way to go before any foreign ally would feel confident investing in them. At the start of 1777, it was clear that the British now had their sights set on the city of Philadelphia. General Howe's plan involved British General John Burgoyne leading a force down from Canada. Burgoyne was under the impression that he would be rendezvousing with Howe's troops at Albany. But Howe decided against marching his troops overland to Philadelphia, and instead determined that he would attack the city by sea. Philadelphia did fall to the British, but Howe's decision left John Burgoyne by himself in upstate New York without reinforcement from Howe's troops, who were busy engaging Washington's troops around Philadelphia. That decision was to have bigger consequences for the British than they could have ever imagined. Because while Washington was taking his lumps against Howe around Philadelphia, he took a risk in sending troops north with Major General Benedict Arnold. He was to meet up with General Horatio Gates, and together they would try to overwhelm Burgoyne's forces. The Americans' chance came in September at a farm in Saratoga, New York. While the British were able to beat back the Americans, it came at a heavy cost. They took much higher casualties, and at the end of the day had advanced no closer to their objective of Albany. Entrenched in Saratoga, using up supplies, with no reinforcements, they watched their position get worse and worse. By October, the Americans had been reinforced by additional militia units. Of course, the British had no way of knowing this when they sent a reconnaissance force out to check on the American position to determine their next move. It will turn out that this is to be their final move. Because while approaching the American defenses, they were spotted, and the daring General Arnold took his troops on the offensive. Finding themselves fighting in wooded terrain, British lines were outflanked and collapsed into retreat. From his position, General Gates could see that the Americans had the upper hand, and sent reinforcements to aid Arnold in his pursuit. The Americans not only caught up to the retreating British reconnaissance party, they followed them all the way to their defensive encampment, completely overrunning their position. Burgoyne knew he'd been defeated, and that his only option was total surrender of his army. It was news of this total victory that, when it reached Benjamin Franklin in Paris, allowed him to finally convince the French that the American cause wasn't hopeless. Another consequence of the Battle of Saratoga was that Horatio Gates was hailed as a hero, while Benedict Arnold, who had led the charge, felt that he never received the credit he deserved, leaving him to grow increasingly bitter. As war raged in their fields and near their towns, life went on for the not-yet Americans. The more patriotically minded tried to keep up with the latest news from the front lines. One young woman's journal of events in early 1777 records, "The accounts hourly coming in are so contradictory and various that we know not which to give credit to. We have heard our people have gained another victory, that the English are fleeing before them." Ordinary civilians attempted to contribute to the war effort by melting down metal objects into bullets and collecting scrap metal from the army. As for the Loyalists, they lived uneasily with the hope that everything would work out for them eventually. And man, how sorry would those rebels be then? Then there were the people, finding themselves between a rock and a hard place, like in occupied New York City or Philadelphia, who were just trying to feel their way and survive. Families like the Shippens, who had to walk a fine line to not upset whoever happened to be in charge that day, because one sign of disloyalty could mean losing everything. The Shippens entertained both the Continental and British armies, striving to stay neutral throughout the conflict. Their daughter, Peggy, would notoriously go on to use her connections in both these spheres to cause a major incident for the Continental Army. The reality is that it's probably impossible to know exactly what percentage of people supported either side. At the end of the day, there were still chores to be done and lives to be lived, no matter who was in charge. This would be the case however the war turned out. But one way that the war did hit home for people was its impact on the cost of living. As mentioned earlier, the continental currency was pretty much worthless, leading to mass inflation. The situation was made worse by the fact that the British blockade was causing everyday goods to be scarce, forcing people to turn to black market smugglers and their exorbitant prices to buy the things they needed. While life was in limbo and anxiety focused on surviving day to day, there were still people who were allowing themselves to think ahead and imagine what life might be like after. Women had to live with the hardships of war just as much as men, keeping the family safe and looking after their finances while the men were away. Independence was just as great a concern to them, and for this reason, Abigail Adams had written to her husband during the debates over declaring independence, urging him and his fellow delegates to remember the ladies. In 1777, a free black man named Prince Hall petitioned the Massachusetts legislature on behalf of 3 black men who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. In the climate of optimism that the revolution had created, he felt that his petition for these men's liberty would find a sympathetic audience. Thomas Paine, an Englishman so inspired by the American Revolution that he immigrated here to be a part of it, summed up the general sense of excitement about what could be in his wildly popular pamphlet, Common Sense. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. This is not the affair of a city, a county, a province, or a kingdom, but of a continent, of at least 1/8 part of the habitable globe. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Only at the end of 1777, it didn't feel like they were anywhere close to triumph. The year had ended on a high note, with the massive victory at Saratoga, but as winter set in, the army needed to prepare for a difficult encampment. Washington decided to winter at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, where conditions were nothing short of awful. Imagine you're a soldier in the Continental Army. You're most likely still a teenager. At this point in the war, soldiers are enlisting for the duration, however long that may end up being. Like many of the wars to come in America's history, it's poor men, immigrants, and members of the working class who bear most of the brunt of the fighting. You, probably a young and uneducated farm laborer, have been marching on foot from New Jersey to New York and now to Pennsylvania, sleeping in tents without a change of clean clothes and few opportunities to practice basic hygiene. Their shoes were falling apart, and they were constantly tormented by lice and bed bugs. Despite Congress's mandate to keep the army well provisioned, they often lacked food and would have to forage for something to eat. Poor living conditions, as well as soldiers' close proximity to one another, bred disease. Yet despite all this, there were reasons for hope. After the success at Saratoga, and the general skill that Washington had shown in harassing the British, the French had decided that they would become actively involved in the war. Up to this point, they had been secretly sending arms, but now they agreed to send ships and soldiers. Another stroke of luck for the Americans was their new military advisor. Baron Friedrich Wilhelm Ludolf Gerhard Augustin von Steuben had been a Prussian military officer who was dismissed under a cloud. An admirer of George Washington's leadership, he offered his services in building a more disciplined Continental Army, an offer that the Americans eagerly accepted. Steuben drilled his charges, trying to instill in them a standard of professionalism in their appearance and in their carriage. He taught them how to move properly in formation and how to fall into precise position at a moment's notice, all skills that went towards making this collection of militias and volunteers a professional fighting force. For their part, the British realized that they needed a new strategy. They decided it would be better to focus on the South, where they thought the people might be a bit more loyalist in their sympathies. The fact that this sounded an awful lot like their initial New York strategy didn't seem to faze them. In the South, they could, in theory, also seize agricultural lands, a major source of America's wealth, and effectively remove that region from the war. With the French now involved, they figured the best thing to do would be to reconcentrate their forces in a region where they hoped to meet with more success. In 1778, George Washington called upon a new secret weapon, the Culper Ring. The Culper Ring was a ring of spies based in New York that was able to keep Washington informed of British movements and thinking while they were quartered in the city. This is one of the ways that he knew that the British were planning to evacuate Philadelphia to refocus on their southern strategy, although he was unaware of that second part. He only knew that they were leaving, and he couldn't be sure where exactly they were going to. For this reason, he sent troops under the young and as yet unproven in battle, Marquis de Lafayette, to observe the British movements. When the British did begin their evacuation of the city, the Continental Army was waiting for them. The engagement turned into a massive artillery battle in over 90-degree heat in Monmouth, New Jersey. In the end, the British were unable to withstand these conditions, and they withdrew. This would effectively be the end of the war in the North. At this point, it's worth asking what people back home in England thought about the war, now that it had been going on for several years. There were still the Whig politicians, critical of the king's policy since the beginning, who had always been more sympathetic to the American cause. And now that France had entered into alliance with the Americans, a simple colonial uprising was starting to look like more than Parliament had bargained for. The cost of keeping an army provisioned 3,000 miles away was going to be immense. Say they did pull out a win, what then? It's not like the army could just leave right after. More unrest was bound to pop up eventually. What were they going to do then? Just keep fighting this war indefinitely? They were running into the same problem that had caused America to become more independent in the first place. It was just too far away. At what cost were they prepared to keep fighting for it? Maybe the British Army's heart was never totally in the fight. Or at least they never fully appreciated what it would take to win. Perhaps it was a combination of hubris and a lack of morale in the face of American victories and dwindling supplies. Their southern strategy met with initial success, but they found that by trying to conquer the entire South, they were stretching themselves too far without hope of being able to effectively resupply. All the Americans would have to do was wait them out. Even when they received a stroke of good luck, they weren't fully able to take advantage of it. Benedict Arnold, still sore over his lack of recognition, was persuaded by his new wife, formerly Peggy Shippen, to defect to her British contacts, made when the army had occupied Philadelphia. Arnold was to turn over the vital West Point fort to British spymaster John Andre. But this plan was foiled by intelligence from the Culper Ring. The Americans truly outspied them. Certainly by 1781, British soldiers had grown weary of war. Quite contrary to the belief that the South was more loyalist, the British were plagued by guerrilla warfare as they battled through the Carolinas. Any success they did have was quickly wiped away by failure to consolidate their gains, as they found themselves low on provisions and constantly harassed by a local population that clearly didn't want them there. Was it premature for the Americans to believe that the end was in sight? Possibly. The British still had the numbers to carry on the war. And while the cost of fighting the war was a lot for them to bear, they weren't the only ones who had that problem. The French were taking on an enormous amount of debt to finance America's war, and they didn't exactly have money to spare. If the war dragged on for much longer, which global superpower would crack under the pressure first? George Washington observed that if they were to win this war, it was now or never. It would appear that British General Cornwallis shared that sentiment and, growing restless with the increasing stalemate in North Carolina, decided to move his forces north to Virginia. Reinforcements joined him there from New York City. Here, both French and American commanders realized, is their chance. One final knockout blow to end the war for good. The commander of the French forces, the Comte de Rochambeau, convinced Washington that the strike must come at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, where the French fleet could coordinate with American forces. A now battle-hardened Lafayette was already in Virginia, practicing his signature American move, striking fast and then melting away. His aim was to keep the British forces distracted while Washington marched his troops south. To confuse British Commander Clinton, headquartered in New York City, Washington sets in motion an elaborate ruse, fake battle plans, and fake encampments. The second part of the plan is in motion. Meanwhile, the French fleet sailing up the coast meets the British fleet at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay and sends them packing. This is the British Navy, which quite famously claimed to rule the waves. Step 3 of the Franco-American knockout blow plan was working. Now to settle in for a siege. Cornwallis's troops had been harried throughout Virginia by Lafayette. He had received thoroughly confusing and conflicting orders from Clinton due to the success of Washington's ruse, and so his move was to firmly entrench along the Virginia coast, at Yorktown. He wasn't to know that this was exactly what the French and Americans wanted. The newly victorious French fleet cut off any chance of escape by sea, and a combined French and American force started building its own entrenched positions around the British position. They were trapped. Allied forces started raining down a relentless bombardment of cannon fire on them. If that wasn't enough, they even began construction of another trench even closer to the British, so they could fire at them from point-blank range. Working at night, the Allies overwhelmed 2 British positions on the river, leaving nothing between them and the now completely helpless British. There was only one real option for them. On October 19, 1781, General Cornwallis formally surrendered to the Americans. British troops were to lay down their weapons and their flag, and they were all taken as prisoners of war. When news reached Britain of the surrender at Yorktown, the Prime Minister was said to have cried, "Oh God, it's all over." When the Continental Congress received word of the victory, they authorized public celebrations. It would seem that they had done it. A loose collection of people from different backgrounds, without any great advantages of birth, and who hadn't even thought of themselves as a collective until just a decade ago, had just defeated the most powerful empire in the world. The following year, British diplomats, meeting with their American counterparts as equals, formally recognized the United States of America as a fact, an independent, autonomous, and self-governed country. John Adams, who was one of the American signatories of the treaty, said of the American Revolution, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it." Epilogue. There is a theory in sociology that all that is necessary for a revolution to occur is for 3.5% of the population to determine that they want change and be motivated enough to bring that change about. That is a hopeful thought for people living under tyranny, but it's also something that should make us pause. Is that really all it takes? A very small amount of engagement? Do the rest of us just wander through our lives, content with our lot, no matter what that looks like? And if it really does only take that little, what is to stop a motivated radical minority, who don't necessarily have the majority's interest in mind, from dictating the new order? It seems that it would be hard for us to know whether or not this is happening, if the majority of us are so disengaged. You can move people to anger with something tangible, like taxes, but to get them to stick around, you need a vision. Revolutionary fervor might have been born from colonists' anger, but it would be difficult to make them sign on to this huge project of starting a whole other country if they had no clear idea what they were working towards. With the Declaration of Independence, they put forward a thesis for what a new kind of country might look like. One where all men, with some blatant exceptions, could start their lives following the same rule book. Here they could expect to live and do as they wanted, so long as they caused no harm to society. And determining whether they did or not wasn't up to one person or body. Deciding on a case-by-case basis who made the cut and who didn't, there'd be rules. You'd have a roadmap. A man could get ahead because he'd know exactly where he stood and the steps he'd need to take. Compared to the topsy-turvy world that Parliament had created with their arbitrary taxes and government acts, a country where people could rely on due process seemed like a good deal. Today, political scientists and campaign strategists would say much the same thing. People might be fired up and angry because of all the things they perceive as wrong in their society, but you won't actually get them to the ballot box unless you offer some alternative idea, something that they can get behind and believe in. And it doesn't appear that the concept of American democracy, the promise offered in the Declaration of Independence, is enough anymore. As important as the promise of due process is, we have unfortunately come to take it for granted, because for many of us, it has become too abstract. It didn't used to be that way. Due process used to be seen as the thing that allowed people to pursue their happiness. But these days, the American dream feels too far out of reach for some people, even with the guarantee that they can count on the law. So do we need to reimagine what the pursuit of happiness looks like and entails for people living in America in the 21st century? One element from our revolutionary past that has come back to haunt us today is the introduction of troops and pseudo-military bodies on our streets and in our lives. It isn't something that's necessarily new to this decade or era that we're in. Questions about police brutality and unreasonable search and seizure have plagued certain groups throughout the modern era. It's just now with the proliferation of being able to record video and post it online, we're able to more clearly see the abuses and impunity by which some of these people operate. So-called law enforcement bodies have gotten particularly bold in recent years, and particularly uncaring about whether they abide by the law or not. They have aims and objectives, and they are incentivized to achieve their mission, unhampered by the due process that would only slow them down. As with British officials escaping consequences in the 18th century, you can only flout the rules and expectations of society for so long before the people's trust in their efficacy erodes completely. If those who the people have put in a position to govern don't bend to public sentiment about something so integral as the rule of law, they might just break those bonds of trust altogether. I let you settle in and get your bearings for the first 2 episodes, but if you're anything like me, you learn best by doing. So that's why I designed this show to be interactive. Find the link to my Substack in the show notes. On Substack, I've linked to the American DNA map, which is exactly what it sounds like. Every idea we come across over the course of the show is connected in, and will continue to be added to, a mind map that represents the American consciousness, all the events and themes that weave together into the spirit of this country. I also have some other features that I wanted to tease that are coming soon, for those who want to dig even deeper. The Lab, my think tank style community, is where I hope to crowdsource information, build movements, and foster activism and calls to action based on the ideas in this show. The first concept I want to dive into? The pursuit of happiness. The other side of these features is the scrapbook, which is more discovery-based. It'll have digital exhibits from aesthetic eras in American history, a patchwork quilt of our many identities, and much more as we go along. It's fun and exciting and gamified, and as of this recording, still a work in progress. But one I hope to be able to share really soon. Maybe I'll see you there.